turn your radio off because there's a feedback and a delay there. It's going to mess you up. Jesse, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Do you want to ask, answer, or do both?
Do both.
Okay.
Maybe things from within the Trump organization. There may be
is getting the money that Puerto Rico is supposed to have. They're not getting some money they want. The needs and wants are two different things.
A fight over money for Puerto Rico holds up disaster recovery funds across the country.
For Tuesday, April 2nd, this is All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm Ari Shapiro.
And I'm Audie Cornish. This hour we'll talk with a senator from one of the states waiting for disaster relief funds.
Also, do problems with the Boeing 737 MAX airplane reveal a broader lack of oversight?
I think the American public would be surprised and maybe even concerned if they knew how widespread the practice of self-regulation was.
Later, Baltimore's mayor goes on leave after a scandal involving a children's book.
This is a clear conflict, and the mayor should have known that these types of relationships and business dealings would be problematic.
And an audio postcard from Hawaii about Mrs. Clacky Pants the albatross.
First News.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. The House Oversight Committee is compelling a key witness to appear before the panel as part of an investigation into allegations security clearances were improperly provided to White House staff. NPR's Tim Mack says the committee acted after an interview with a White House whistleblower named Trisha Newbold.
The whistleblower is claiming that in at least 25 cases, career staff recommended denying a security clearance, only to see this recommendation overruled by senior officials without proper documentation or analysis. Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings said the subpoena is meant to send a message.
The White House needs to understand that they cannot install this committee for months.
A key figure in this investigation is a former White House staffer named Carl Klein, previously the director of the White House Personnel Security Office. While Klein's lawyer said he would be willing to testify on general matters, the committee found that insufficient and decided to subpoena him. Tim Mack, NPR News, Washington.
Volunteer and nonprofit organizations near the U.S. border with Mexico are struggling to meet the needs of thousands of migrants now coming into the U.S. daily. NPR's Ashley Brown reports from El Paso. Some local charity leaders say the humanitarian needs they're seeing are unprecedented.
The Salvation Army expects to start feeding as many as 1,500 migrants a day in El Paso alone, up from 800 meals a day last week. And meals are far from the only need for migrants, says Major Brett Meredith. He helps coordinate the Salvation Army's operations in Texas.
They come in with clothing that's been worn for maybe several months, shoes that have been through water many times, and they haven't had shelter in a long time.
Annunciation House also helps provide services for migrant families across El Paso and says U.S. Border and Immigration authorities are now releasing about 4,500 people to them for help per week. That represents the largest surge in migrants the group has seen since 2014. Ashley Brown, NPR News, El Paso.
With Britain increasingly moving towards what is looking like a chaotic exit from the European Union in a matter of days, British Prime Minister Theresa May is again calling for some additional breathing room. May, who's repeatedly failed to win Parliament's backing for her EU divorce deal, says some agreement is still preferable.
I know there are some who are so fed up with delay and endless arguments that they would like to leave with no deal next week. I've always been clear that we could make a success of no deal in the long term. But leaving with a deal is the best solution.
May has offered to hold talks with opposition Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn in an attempt to find a compromise. EU leaders have warned without an agreement, the so-called no-deal Brexit is likely. Stocks have been bouncing around between losses today. The market ending up mixed. The Dow down 79 points. The Nasdaq up 19. This is NPR.
For WKMS News, I'm Matt Mark Graff. Trade disputes between the U.S. and other countries are leaving many Kentucky farmers uncertain about the global market for soybeans. As Rhonda Miller of member station WKYU reports, soybeans have been the Commonwealth's largest agricultural export.
Kentucky farmers told the U.S. Department of Agriculture Regional Statistics Office in Louisville they're expecting to plant 1.75 million acres of soybeans this year. That's down from 2 million acres of soybeans last year, a decrease of 12%. Director of the regional office, David Knopp, says there's a natural rotation of fields between soybeans and corn, and Kentucky's soybean acres planned for this year are within a 5-year average. But Knopp says the 12% decline is noticeable.
This year may be a little bit stronger downward trend in the soybean acres, and that, of course, is being influenced by the market uncertainty resulting from the trade disruptions. So I think that's an added contributing factor to this year's decline in soybean acreage.
Tariffs on trade with China have had an impact on soybean farmers across the U.S. In Bowling Green, I'm Rhonda Miller.
Groups that help register Tennessee voters could face fines or misdemeanors if they violate new restrictions in a bill advancing through the legislature. Republican Representative Tim Rudd's bill calls for Class A misdemeanors if workers are paid based on voter sign-up quotas, state training isn't completed, or completed voter registration forms aren't shipped within 10 days of registration drives. Tennessee also could fine groups that submit 100 or more deficient voter registration forms. State Elections Coordinator Mark Goins says more than 10,000 Shelby County registrations, many filled out incorrectly, were submitted on last year's deadline by the Tennessee Black Voter Project. Voting rights groups, Democratic Congressman Jim Cooper, and other opponents called it voter suppression. And Discovery Park of America in Union City, Tennessee, has rebranded its cafe to honor local photography legends of the 1920s. Park officials say Sabin's Cafe features the work of Vern and Noni Sabin, who captured photos of local life on Velvet Lake 100 years ago. See more of this story at WKMS.org. For WKMS News, I'm Matt Graff.
Support for NPR comes from Creative Planning, an independent wealth management firm whose advisors are fiduciaries, legally bound to act in their clients' best interests. More at creativeplanning.com/NPR. Wealth Management Redefined, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Ari Shapiro.
And I'm Audie Cornish. There are a few things Democrats and Republicans in Congress usually agree on, like rushing federal money to victims of natural disasters. That normal order of things fell apart this week. The Senate failed to advance 2 separate bills to help people across the country who suffered from flooding, wildfires, tornadoes, and hurricanes.
This stalemate comes down to just one thing: how much aid to give to Puerto Rico, which is still recovering from Hurricane Maria. Republicans blame Democrats, and Democrats blame, well, let's just listen to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
Everything was moving along, and guess who came in and messed it up as usual? The president.
Yes, President Trump. We begin our coverage with NPR congressional reporter Kelsey Snell on Capitol Hill. Hi, Kelsey.
Hi there.
Explain what's at the heart of this battle over aid to Puerto Rico.
Well, I think we should start off by saying that these disaster aid bills are usually pretty bipartisan, and they usually move really quickly, mostly because you never really know when the next disaster will happen or where it will strike. So senators like to vote to support, sending money just in case they might be next. So Democrats say Trump is specifically denying money for Puerto Rico, and they point to comments from the White House referring to the island territory, which we should say is very much a part of the United States, as a different country. Republicans say Puerto Rico still hasn't spent money that was authorized in the past, and Senator Shelby, who is the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, he said last week that Puerto Rico has a history of not spending money well when it's given to them. Democrats say all American citizens should have the same access to disaster assistance, no matter where they are.
Kelsey, will you fact check for us a tweet from President Trump where he said today that the island got $91 billion for the hurricanes? Democrats say that is not true. Who's right here?
Yeah, there's a lot of dispute over that number on the Hill. So there is a report out there that says Puerto Rico will have access to that amount of money over years, if not decades. But that isn't what's been sent to the island so far. Democrats say Puerto Rico hasn't received enough money. They're seizing basically on Trump's recent comments, and they say that he just doesn't want to send money to Puerto Rico, period. They're basically saying that the administration hasn't released a lot of money that Congress already authorized. And this is a problem for states like Texas, too, but the political fight is all about Puerto Rico right now. It really only since Trump singled out Puerto Rico. And this, like I said, is really political. Democrats want to highlight the president denying money to a largely Hispanic territory.
What else do Democrats say the island needs for recovery?
Yeah. They say that they need money for basic redevelopment. We're talking about stuff like roads and bridges and basic phone and internet infrastructure. And it's all about this one program known as the Community Development Block Grant. Now, this is a pot of money primarily focused on housing and service for low-income communities. Now, Trump approved money for nutrition assistance or food stamps, but not the Community Development Block Grant. And that's where Democrats say they really need money.
How do they move forward if neither side seems ready to move on this?
That is the big question, and nobody seems to have an answer. And the fight is already causing people to have some big worries about how Congress will spend money for the entire rest of the year. Remember, we have to keep the government open again in September, and they can't seem to agree on anything when it comes down to money.
It's NPR's Kelsey Snell on Capitol Hill. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you.
We're joined now by Republican Senator Johnny Isakson of Georgia, co-sponsored the Senate bill that failed to pass last night. Welcome back to the program.
Glad to be with you.
Now, you want this money, of course, because of the devastation caused to Georgia farmers by Hurricane Michael last year. Tell us what state they're in, why they need this funding so badly.
Well, first of all, the damage was devastating, particularly in southwest Georgia, where the pecans were hit terribly hard near Camilla and in that area. Pecans are not an annual crop, but they're a multi-year crop. It takes about 12 years for a tree to mature. About 70% of our trees were injured or taken out, and that's a terrible amount. We also had cotton that was destroyed in large amounts. Can't quantify by bales because we hadn't picked it yet.
And, of course, agriculture is the top industry in Georgia, right? And I understand it's something like a $50 billion loss at this point.
It's 21% of our gross domestic product for our state, which is huge. And I don't know the total amount quantified in dollars yet, but it's been huge damage to our state and to our agriculture interest.
When you talk about something like a pecan crop and a long lead time, I mean, what does that mean for the bottom line for these farmers, right, when there's a delay in funding of aid from Congress?
In the worst case, it could mean the loss of your farm because you don't have income to sustain the property during the 12 years while you're trying to remake the crop. In cases where you are in pretty good shape financially, it could take away your safety net for the future. Either way, it's not good for agriculture. Agriculture is a critical crop. It's time sensitive, it's weather sensitive, it's farmer sensitive, and it's politically sensitive, as we learned with this disaster aid. So we've got to pull all those together to get our industry back together in our state.
Say they rejected this bill because it doesn't provide enough aid for Puerto Rico. Can you address that issue?
Yes, ma'am, I can. Puerto Rico has already gotten money, which they've already spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million. The money that we put in this bill that's before us now that they'd set back last night or defeated last night was $600 million. So Puerto Rico is getting the money that Puerto Rico is supposed to have. They're not getting some money they want, but needs and wants are two different things, and nobody's getting the want stuff. The need stuff we're doing to make sure our ag industry, the fires which have devastated California, the earthquake which devastated Alaska.
But can I jump in here, because there's $41 billion that has been set aside for recovery for Puerto Rico, and they haven't gotten it. So it's not just that they want it, it's something the government has said we're supposed to deliver to you, and the government hasn't come through on that.
They haven't yet, but they're going to if we pass this bill. So we're going to have to use some leverage to get it done now that they've all of a sudden started creating obstacles for us to move forward, which I think, and I don't know, I'm not blaming anybody, but it seems to me like it's a political operation right now.
By who?
And by the Democrats.
To what end? I mean, because to the average listener, to the voter at home, it sounds like voters are pitting two struggling communities, right? People who suffered from natural disasters.
No, that's not the way it is at all. What's happening is one of the two political parties has been pushing to get the disaster aid through. It's money that's out there to be appropriated, but we have to do it by an act of Congress. The people who are trying to make that happen and slow all this down are people who have issues with Puerto Rico. They want Puerto Rico to become a state, so they're trying to make a case out of that. They want more votes in the Senate, so if Puerto Rico is a state, they get 2 more votes in the Senate. Lots of things like that, but that's just the petty politics side of it. The truth of the matter is we've just got some Georgians and some Americans that have been damaged for which there's money out there to be provided to them, including Puerto Ricans as a territory. We ought to go ahead and do it instead of pick favorites and winners and losers. We're all losers. We don't want to pick tragic losers, and that's what's going to happen.
The Trump administration has yet to issue rules and regulations that would allow Puerto Rico and other states to get access to the funding that is set aside for it. Has the administration said anything about this? Is this something that you think needs to be discussed?
Anything that would help us get the money released would help us, and everybody should be doing their job, and I'm doing mine, but I'm not about to start opining on the administration or the executive branch or anybody else not doing theirs. I just know that if there's something out there that they should have done, then the president should get it done and get it done as soon as possible.
Well, I ask because the president has been very vocal about what he thinks of leadership in Puerto Rico, and that he doesn't believe necessarily that they are handling the funds they get properly. Has this become an obstacle in these negotiations, a political obstacle?
Well, things like that could become obstacles. I'm not saying it is one because I haven't been engaged in that conversation one way or another, and I'm not going to engage myself in this interview. And all I want to do is one thing. That's my job for the people in my state that are hurting, and the states in the other parts of the country that are hurting. As to who to blame or who to call obstructionists or who to call not doing their job, I'm not about to sit there and do that.
Senator Johnny Isakson, he's a Republican from Georgia. Thank you for speaking with All Things Considered.
You betcha. Thank you.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Ari Shapiro.
And I'm Audie Cornish. Ever since the Ethiopian Airlines crash 3 weeks ago, the Federal Aviation Administration has been under scrutiny. The agency had delegated to Boeing much of the testing of its 737 MAX jets. Critics say the FAA let the company basically certify its own plane. But as NPR's Brian Naylor reports, that sort of thing happens a lot.
The FAA's model of self-regulation has come under attack from the government's own watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, which as far back as the 1990s criticized the practice. But James Goodwin of the Center for Progressive Reform, a left-leaning research group, says it's a model that's used throughout government.
I think the American public would be surprised and maybe even concerned if they knew how widespread the practice of self-regulation was.
It's especially prevalent in agencies that regulate single industries like the FAA with air transport or the Federal Railroad Administration, which allows self-certification of conductors and engineers on trains. Thomas McGarity of the University of Texas Law School says you can also see it at the Department of Interior's Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, known as BSEE.
It's the agency that failed pretty badly with the Deepwater Horizon blowout several years ago. It's a single agency regulator, and it allows owners of offshore oil rigs to self-certify, do their annual certifications.
After the blowout, the Obama administration reorganized the agency and required well operators to hire independent third parties to conduct safety checks. Now, the Trump administration is trying to roll that regulation back. In a video on the agency's website, BSEE Director Scott Angiel said the changes will not harm safety or the environment.
I am confident when reviewing the proposed revisions to the rule, you will likewise conclude BSEE's team of career engineers and regulatory specialists used a scalpel rather than a chainsaw seeking to improve public policy.
Angiel is a former oil pipeline company board member, and his background illustrates another concern about government agencies relying on industries to self-regulate. UT's McGarity says there's often a revolving door between the two.
That can really make things questionable sometimes because the person working in the agency may well anticipate that in a few years he or she will go out and take a job with that regulated industry.
Peter Van Doren, a senior fellow at the Libertarian Cato Institute, argues self-regulation has largely gone on unnoticed because with a few exceptions, it's been a success.
In effect, the delegation of all this to experts and the lack of second-guessing about all this occurred because it was working.
The Food and Drug Administration is another agency that relies on industry, in this case drug manufacturers, to test their own new drugs with the data then certified by FDA scientists. Goodwin at the Center for Progressive Reform says agencies don't have the funding they need to do more extensive oversight.
Agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration and the Food and Drug Administration just don't have the resources or the technological capacity
to keep up with the rapidly evolving industries that they're charged with overseeing.
In fact, the acting director of the FAA said it would take nearly $2 billion and 10,000 new employees for the agency to end its reliance on the aircraft manufacturers to conduct their own certification tests. Brian Naylor, NPR News, Washington.
The next time you eat a hamburger or a steak, chances are it'll come from an animal that was fed antibiotics during the last few months of its life. This is one of the most controversial uses of antibiotics in American farming. There is growing pressure on the beef industry to stop the practice. Some cattle feedlots already have. NPR's Dan Charles visited a farm to understand the trade-offs.
It was cold and wet the day I visited Phelps County Feeders near Kearney, Nebraska. A bad day for Joe Clutie, one of the owners here. The weather was making his 15,000 cattle miserable, and unhappy cattle don't gain weight.
You know, I mean, you spend all this time and energy and effort and money to put weight on them that you hope to get paid on, and now it's going to be gone.
Really? Just because of the stress?
The weather stress.
Clutie shows me the raw ingredients of beef. Cattle feed, giant bales of hay, piles of chopped up fermented corn plants called silage, steaming flattened kernels of corn.
They get cornflakes for breakfast, just like we do.
Also, micro-ingredients like vitamins. They get dissolved in water, mixed into truckloads of corn and hay.
On a 20,000-pound load, those micro-ingredients are probably going to be less than a pound.
And one of these micro-ingredients is a drug, an antibiotic called Tylosin. It's in there because when cattle eat a high-energy diet, which they do in feedlots to fatten them up quickly, many develop abscesses of the liver. A little Tylosin every day keeps the abscesses away, which is great for the feedlot. But Lance Price, who runs the Antibiotic Resistance Action Center at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., says it's not so great for the rest of us.
It's basically a public health decision that they're making.
Tylosin is very similar to an antibiotic that people take, Price says, erythromycin. It's an important tool to fight off infections, and we should use those drugs sparingly.
When you feed these antibiotics to these animals, it puts pressure on all the bacteria that are in and on that animal, right? And those bacteria respond to that antibiotic and eventually become resistant to it.
Down the line, these bacteria could infect people, and you wouldn't be able to treat them with erythromycin. The Food and Drug Administration has stopped some uses of antibiotics in animals. Farmers can't use them anymore to make cattle grow faster, but they can give drugs to treat or prevent disease, including liver abscesses, which gets Lance Price kind of angry.
We are creating this disease. We are creating liver abscesses in these animals by the way we're raising them.
Raise them differently, he says, and you wouldn't need Tylosin. In fact, some people in the beef industry are already doing this. They're doing it at Phelps County Feeders. About 40% of the cattle at Joe Clutie's cold, wet feedlot are not getting any Tylosin. No growth-promoting hormones either. Clutie sells this beef as all natural, gets more money for it. I visited another farm in Iowa that's completely antibiotic-free. It grows cattle for the company Nyman Ranch, and both places are doing it